Hello. I guess it all started when my wife, Megan, decided she needed therapy. It wasn't like I didn't see it coming. We had been going through a rough patch for a while, and I was fully supportive of her finding someone to talk to. Honestly, I thought therapy was a great idea. Mental health is important and all that. Plus, it gave me a chance to have the TV all to myself during her sessions. I figured a little professional help would do wonders for her. So, Megan started seeing Dr. Brandon, a therapist who came highly recommended by her friend, Lisa. Dr. Brandon was apparently great at listening, giving advice, and helping people work through their issues. He had a calming voice, a PhD on the wall, and even wore those glasses that made him look extra smart. Megan seemed to be in good hands, and I was just happy that she was finally talking to someone who wasn't me. After her first few sessions, Megan came home with a renewed energy. She was happier, more relaxed, and a lot more positive. It was like a switch had flipped, and I couldn't have been more thrilled. I mean, who wouldn't be happy about their spouse being in a better mood? I was even bragging to my friends about how Megan's therapy sessions were working wonders for her. They'd ask how I was doing, and I'd say, "Therapy's amazing, 10 out of 10 would recommend. I've got my happy wife back." But as time went on, I noticed that she started spending a lot more time at her therapy sessions. What was originally an hour once a week turned into 2-hour sessions, sometimes even 3. She'd come home with a huge smile on her face and a little extra spring in her step. One day, she came back with a smoothie, saying, "Dr. Brandon suggested we go for a walk and grab some smoothies after the session. You should have seen it. Dave, it was so relaxing." "Smoothies with the therapist, huh?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Is that part of the treatment?" She laughed and said, "Of course, it's all part of the holistic healing experience." I shrugged it off, figuring that if smoothies and walks with Dr. Brandon were helping, then why not? Who was I to judge what therapy was supposed to look like? But then things started getting weird. One evening, I was scrolling through my phone, half watching some reality TV nonsense, when Megan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but the notification preview caught my eye. "Dr. Brandon, hey Meg, I had an amazing." I didn't read the rest of the message, but the word amazing was enough to make me pause. Who was sending their therapist messages like that? And why was he calling her Meg? Only people who knew her really well called her Meg. Something didn't sit right, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe amazing was referring to some breakthrough she had during therapy. Maybe Dr. Brandon was just an overly enthusiastic therapist who liked to stay in touch with his clients. Still, I couldn't shake the weird feeling I had. A few days later, I decided to bring it up to Megan. Casually, of course. We were sitting at the dinner table, and I cleared my throat, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "So, Dr. Brandon seems pretty invested in your therapy." "Huh?" I said, my fork hovering over my plate. Megan looked up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he texts you a lot, doesn't he?" I tried to keep my voice light. "Like, outside of therapy?" She frowned, setting her fork down. "He's just being supportive, Dave. Therapy isn't just about the sessions. It's about the whole experience. Dr. Brandon believes in building a supportive relationship with his clients. It's totally normal." I nodded, trying to hide my skepticism. "Yeah, sure. Just seems like he's really invested." Megan rolled her eyes. "Dave, you don't understand. Therapy is more than just sitting in a room talking about your feelings. It's about connection. Dr. Brandon is helping me make real progress, and I don't need you making it weird." Well, that shut me up. I didn't want to be the jealous husband who didn't support his wife's mental health journey. So I dropped it. If she said it was normal, then who was I to say otherwise? But as the weeks went by, more and more red flags started popping up. Megan started dressing up more for her therapy sessions. Nothing too obvious, but definitely a little more effort than you'd expect for a casual appointment. She started wearing that perfume I knew she only put on for special occasions, and she'd leave the house with this glow that made me feel like something was off. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was all part of her journey to happiness. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One day, I came home early from work, something I never usually did. I had a migraine, and I just wanted to crash on the couch and sleep it off. I walked through the door, expecting to find the house empty since Megan was supposed to be at her therapy session. But instead, I heard voices coming from the living room. I paused, my heart pounding as I listened. It was Megan's voice and someone else. A man. A man who sounded an awful lot like Dr. Brandon. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer, peeking around the corner. There, sitting on our living room couch, was Megan. Laughing, her face flushed, her body turned toward none other than Dr. Brandon himself. He was sitting far too close, his hand resting casually on her knee as he spoke in that smooth, therapist-y voice of his. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My wife was sitting on our couch, looking all cozy with her therapist, who, by the way, was definitely not supposed to be doing home visits. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding, my face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. "Megan," I said, my voice trembling. She jumped, her eyes wide with shock as she looked up at me. "Dave, what are you doing home?" she stammered, her face turning pale. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my eyes narrowing as I glanced at Dr. Brandon. "And what's he doing here?" Dr. Brandon cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably on the couch. Mr. Cooper, I can explain." I crossed my arms, my heart pounding as I stared at them both. "Oh, I'd love to hear it," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Please enlighten me." Megan looked at Dr. Brandon, her eyes pleading, but he just sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You know what, Meg?" he said, his voice exasperated. "I think it's time we told him." "Told me what?" I demanded, my eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" Dr. Brandon stood up, his expression resigned as he looked at me. "Mr. Cooper, Dave, Megan and I have been seeing each other outside of therapy. It's not what you think. It started as a professional relationship, but it became more." I stared at him, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, my voice filled with disbelief. "You're her therapist. This is completely unethical," he sighed, nodding. "I know, and I take full responsibility. I never meant for it to get this far, but, well, emotions can be complicated." "Complicated?" I shouted. "You're a therapist, and you're supposed to be helping her, not dating her." Megan looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Dave, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this." "Find out like what?" I said, my voice cracking. "That you've been cheating on me with your therapist?" Dr. Brandon raised his hands, trying to calm the situation. "Look, Dave, I know this is a shock, but..." "Shock? Oh, I'm way beyond shocked, buddy," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just trying to figure out how you thought any of this was okay." Megan stood up, her face flushed with emotion. "Dave, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry, but Dr. Brandon and we've decided to end things. It's not right, and we both know that." I blinked, staring at her in disbelief. "You're breaking up with him?" I asked, my voice filled with confusion. "You've been having an affair with your therapist, and now you're just ending it?" Dr. Brandon cleared his throat, nodding. "Yes, we both agreed that this isn't what either of us wants. It was a mistake, and we're going to do what's right." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife had been cheating on me with her therapist, and now they were standing in my living room, telling me they were breaking up like it was just some casual fling that had run its course. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or scream. Instead, I just stood there, shaking my head, trying to process everything that had happened. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was for sure. Therapy was definitely off the table for a while. Standing in the living room, I felt like I was stuck in some bizarre soap opera. My wife, Megan, and her therapist, Dr. Brandon, stood there in front of me, talking about their affair like it was some unfortunate accident they'd both stumbled into. And now they were breaking up, if you could even call it that. It was absurd, and I honestly didn't know what to feel. Anger? Betrayal? Maybe even a bit of humor at just how ridiculous the whole thing was. Megan cleared her throat. Her eyes filled with tears as she stepped toward me. "Dave, please, can we talk about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. I threw my hands up in the air, letting out a humorless laugh. "Talk about what, Megan? About how you were cheating on me with the guy who was supposed to help you with your problems. And what is this, a formal breakup? Are we supposed to sit here and have a therapy session about you ending it with him?" Megan winced, looking over at Dr. Brandon, who shifted awkwardly, his face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but I shot him a look that immediately shut him up. "No, Brandon, you don't get to say anything right now," I said, my voice filled with frustration. "You're a therapist, for God's sake. Isn't there a rule against this? Like, a big, glaring rule that says, don't date your patients?" Dr. Brandon nodded, his shoulders slumping. "There are rules, yes," he said quietly, "and I broke them. I'm deeply sorry for everything, Dave. I never intended for this to happen." "Yeah, well, intentions don't really matter much now, do they?" I said, shaking my head. I turned to Megan, my heart pounding, the anger still bubbling up inside me. "What were you thinking, Meg? I thought you went to therapy to fix things, not to, whatever this is." She wiped her tears, her face flushed as she looked at me. "I was confused, Dave," she said softly. "I was feeling lost, and Brandon was there. He listened, and it just happened. But I know it was wrong. I know I've hurt you, and I'll do anything to make this right." I sighed, my chest tightening, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the regret that she carried. But I also couldn't just forget what she had done. Couldn't just move past it like it was nothing. Before I could respond, Dr. Brandon cleared his throat, glancing at both of us. "Look, I think it's best if I leave now," he said awkwardly, taking a step toward the door. "I'll leave you two to talk. I really am sorry for everything." I rolled my eyes as he made his exit, watching as he practically sprinted out of the door. Once he was gone, I turned back to Megan, letting out a long sigh. "So what now?" I asked, my voice filled with exhaustion. "Where do we go from here, Meg?" She hesitated, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at me. "I want to fix this, Dave," she whispered. "I want to work through this, and I want to be better for us. I know I've made terrible choices, but I love you. I love you, and I want to fight for us." I looked at her, my heart aching, the pain still raw. "I don't know if I can just forgive you, Megan," I said, my voice trembling. "This wasn't just some mistake. This was months of lying, months of keeping secrets." She nodded, her tears falling faster. "I know," she whispered, "and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust again, even if it takes forever." I took a deep breath, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that we could find a way to move forward. But I also couldn't deny the hurt that I felt, the betrayal that still cut deep. "All right," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "One step at a time. But if we're going to do this, we're going to need some ground rules. First of all, no more Dr. Brandon. I don't care if you need therapy. Find someone who doesn't have romantic feelings for you. All right?" Megan let out a shaky laugh, nodding. "Agreed," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I'll find someone else. Someone strictly professional." "Good," I said, my voice softening slightly. "And no more secrets. If we're going to move forward, I need complete honesty. No more hiding things from me." She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I promise, Dave. I'll be completely honest with you from now on." The next few weeks were awkward, to say the least. Megan and I were trying to find a way back to each other, but the shadow of her affair with Dr. Brandon loomed over everything. It was hard to look at her without remembering that she had chosen someone else, someone who was supposed to be helping her, not taking advantage of her vulnerabilities. But I could also see how hard she was trying to make things right. She was open with me, transparent about everything she was doing, and she even started seeing a new therapist, an older woman named Dr. Thompson, who Megan assured me was completely safe. One afternoon, I came home from work and found Megan in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by candles and crystals. I blinked, staring at her in confusion. What's going on here? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Megan looked up at me, her eyes bright with excitement. It's part of my new therapy routine, she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. Dr. Thompson suggested I try some self-healing practices, and she recommended crystal therapy. It's supposed to be really calming. I couldn't help but laugh, shaking my head as I walked over to her. Crystal therapy, huh? I said, my voice filled with amusement. And does it work? She smiled, shrugging. It helps me feel more centered, she said. And besides, it's better than having smoothies with Dr. Brandon, right? I laughed, shaking my head. I guess anything is better than that. We were trying, both of us were. And as strange and ridiculous as the situation had become, I could see that Megan was committed to making things work. And maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for us. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, watching some mindless reality TV show, Megan turned to me, her face serious. Dave, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I've said it 1,000 times, but I need you to know how truly sorry I am for everything. I know I hurt you, and I know I made terrible choices, but I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I looked at her, my heart aching, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the determination to make things work. And despite everything, despite the pain and the betrayal, I knew that I still loved her too. I love you too, Meg, I said softly, my voice cracking, and I'm willing to try. One day at a time, all right? She nodded, her tears spilling over, her smile widening. One day at a time. As we sat there, the TV playing in the background, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect. But we were both willing to try, and that was enough for now. And as for Dr. Brandon, well, I hoped I'd never have to see his smug therapist face again. Things were starting to settle into a new, awkward routine. Megan and I were slowly trying to rebuild our relationship. There were still moments when I felt the sting of betrayal, but Megan was doing everything she could to regain my trust. She was open, honest, and went out of her way to make me feel like I was her priority. And, surprisingly, the crystal therapy sessions seemed to help her relax, even if they looked a bit silly to me. But then, just when I thought things might actually be improving, the universe decided to throw a curveball our way. It was a Saturday morning, and Megan was in the kitchen making breakfast, pancakes to be precise. I was still in my pajamas, savoring the smell of coffee and the sound of Megan humming a tune while she cooked. Felt normal, like maybe we were finally getting back to the way things used to be. And then the doorbell rang. I frowned, glancing at Megan, who just shrugged. Maybe it's a package? She said, flipping a pancake. I nodded, getting up from the couch and heading to the door. I opened it, fully expecting to see the UPS guy, or maybe a neighbor dropping by for something. But instead, standing on my doorstep, wearing that ridiculous therapist-y smile of his, was none other than Dr. Brandon. I blinked, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered, shaking my head. Brandon's smile faltered slightly, but he tried to keep his composure. Dave, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I really need to talk to Megan, he said, his voice calm but pleading. My jaw clenched, my hands tightening around the doorframe. You're right. You are the last person I want to see, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. What do you think you're doing here, Brandon? You really think showing up unannounced is a good idea? He held up his hands, trying to look non-threatening. I know. I shouldn't be here, but I need to speak with Megan. It's important. Well, she doesn't need to talk to you, I snapped, trying to keep my voice low so Megan wouldn't hear. In case you missed the memo, she broke up with you, buddy. She's done. Brandon let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping. I know, Dave. I know it's over. But I think there are some things she needs to hear from me. Please, just let me talk to her. I was about to tell him to leave before I called the police. But before I could say anything, Megan appeared behind me, her eyes widening when she saw who was at the door. Brandon, she said, her voice filled with surprise and confusion. What are you doing here? He looked at her, his expression softening. Meg, I know I shouldn't be here, but I needed to see you. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized there are things I need to say, things I should have said before. I could feel my blood pressure rising as he used that nickname again. Meg. It was something only I called her, something personal between the two of us. I shot him a glare, but Megan put her hand on my arm, her expression filled with a mix of confusion and concern. It's okay, Dave, she said softly. Let me just hear him out, and then he'll leave. I shook my head, my chest tightening. Megan, I really don't think. Please, she whispered, her eyes pleading. I just need to hear what he has to say. I took a deep breath, my jaw clenched, but I reluctantly stepped aside, allowing Brandon into the house. He walked into the living room, his hands in his pockets, looking far too comfortable for my liking. Megan led him over to the couch, and I stood by the kitchen doorway, my arms crossed, watching the entire scene unfold. Brandon cleared his throat, glancing at Megan, his face serious. Meg, I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us. I know I crossed a line that should never be crossed. And I've realized that what I did wasn't just unethical. It was wrong. You came to me for help, and I took advantage of that. Megan looked down, her hands clasped in her lap. I know, Brandon. I was vulnerable, and I let myself get caught up in something I shouldn't have. But it's over now. I'm trying to fix things with Dave. He nodded, his expression pained. And I'm glad you're doing that. You deserve to be happy, and Dave, well, he's clearly a good man for sticking by you after everything. But there's something else you need to know. I narrowed my eyes, my chest tightening. What do you mean, something else? I asked, my voice filled with suspicion. Brandon hesitated, glancing at both of us, his face filled with regret. I haven't been completely honest. The truth is, I wasn't supposed to get involved with any of my clients, but the organization I was working for, they knew about it. They encouraged me to, let's say, get close to certain clients who had wealthy spouses. They thought it would be beneficial to gather information, financial information. They pressured me, and I gave in. Megan's eyes widened, her face going pale. Wait, are you saying you were using me? That this whole thing was part of some scheme? She stammered, her voice filled with disbelief. Brandon shook his head quickly, his expression desperate. No, Meg, not like that. At first, yes, there were pressures, but what we had, it was real. I swear it. But I couldn't live with the lie anymore, and I wanted to come clean. I want to make things right. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. Wow, this just keeps getting better and better, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Not only were you cheating with my wife, but now you're telling us you were also trying to scam us? You've got some nerve, Brandon. Megan looked at me, her face filled with a mixture of shock and pain. Dave, I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, the regret etched across her face, and despite everything, my heart ached for her. She had been manipulated, taken advantage of, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness toward her. Look, Brandon, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You've done enough damage. If you're really sorry, then the best thing you can do is leave us alone. Megan and I are trying to fix things, and we don't need you showing up here, making everything even more complicated. Brandon nodded, his face filled with regret. I understand, he said softly. I really am sorry for everything. I hope you both can find happiness. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Megan and me alone in the living room, the weight of everything he had said hanging heavily between us. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Megan looked at me, her tears spilling over, her face filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "Dave, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had no idea that any of this was happening. I never wanted to hurt you like this." I walked over to her, my heart aching as I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly. "I know, Meg," I said softly, my voice cracking. "I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen, and I know you're trying to make things right. It's a lot to process." She nodded against my chest, her tears soaking into my shirt. "I love you, Dave," she whispered, "and I'm going to keep fighting for us, no matter what." I took a deep breath, my chest tightening as I held her close. "I love you too, Meg," I said softly, "and we're going to get through this, one day at a time." As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I realized that the road ahead was still uncertain. There were still wounds that needed to heal, still trust that needed to be rebuilt. But for now, we were facing it together, and that was enough. And as for Brandon, I hoped that would be the last we'd ever see of him. Therapy was supposed to be about healing, but if there was one thing I'd learned from all of this, it was that sometimes the people who are supposed to help you can end up being the ones who hurt you the most. After the unexpected visit from Dr. Brandon, it felt like we were trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle of our relationship while blindfolded, and half the pieces were missing. Megan and I were left with more questions than answers, and I knew I couldn't just let this all go. Not only had my wife cheated with her therapist, but that therapist had also admitted to being part of some shady financial scheme. It was almost too ridiculous to believe, like we were living in some twisted TV drama. For a few days, Megan and I didn't talk much about Brandon. We just needed a break. From him, from the constant reminders of what had happened, from everything. We focused on each other instead. We went out for walks, watched stupid comedies, and even tried our hand at making sushi, which ended with rice all over the kitchen floor and me almost losing a finger. But it was fun, and for the first time in a while, I felt like we were finding each other again. Then, out of nowhere, Megan got a message from Lisa, her friend who had recommended Dr. Brandon in the first place. Lisa and Megan had been friends since college, and they had always been close. When Megan first told Lisa about her struggles, Lisa had insisted that Dr. Brandon was the answer to all her problems. I never blamed Lisa for what happened. It wasn't her fault that Brandon turned out to be a creep. But when Megan got that message, I could see her face pale as she read it. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting my coffee down, concern flooding over me. Megan hesitated, her eyes scanning the screen before she looked up at me, her expression filled with worry. "It's Lisa," she said quietly. "She says she needs to talk to me about Brandon. She said it's important." My heart sank. "Do you think she knows about everything?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Megan shook her head. "I don't know. She said it's something she just found out and that it's serious." I frowned, my curiosity piqued. "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked. She smiled at me, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "I think I should go alone. Lisa might be more open if it's just the two of us. I'll fill you in on everything when I get back." Reluctantly, I agreed, though the idea of Megan dealing with anything related to Brandon on her own made me uneasy. But I trusted her, and I knew she needed to handle this her own way. I spent the afternoon nervously watching the clock, waiting for Megan to get back home. When she finally walked through the door, I could tell right away that something was wrong. Her eyes were red, and she looked like she had been crying. She sat down on the couch, her shoulders slumping as she let out a heavy sigh. "What happened?" I asked gently, sitting down beside her, my heart pounding. Megan took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she wiped at her eyes. "Lisa told me some things about Brandon," she said softly. "Things that I didn't know. Apparently, I wasn't the only one he got involved with. There were other clients. Lisa found out because she ran into one of them. They were talking about how amazing Dr. Brandon was, and she put two and two together." I blinked, staring at her in disbelief. "You're saying he was seeing other clients, too? Like, romantically?" Megan nodded, her tears spilling over. "Yes, he was using his position to get close to vulnerable women, and apparently I wasn't the first or the last. Lisa feels terrible about everything, about recommending him to me. She had no idea. I shook my head, my mind reeling. This guy is unbelievable, I muttered. Not only was he trying to get financial information, but he was also, how is he even still practicing? Megan let out a shaky laugh, her eyes filled with sadness. I don't know, but Lisa said she's going to report him to the licensing board. She said she's already gathered statements from some of the other women. They're all going to come forward. I looked at her, my heart aching. Are you going to be one of them? I asked softly. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know, Dave. Part of me wants to, but another part of me just wants to put this all behind us. I don't want to keep reliving it. I nodded, reaching out to take her hand in mine. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you. We'll get through this together. The days that followed were a strange mix of emotions. Megan decided she was going to come forward, and she contacted Lisa to let her know. She said that if there was a chance to stop Brandon from doing this to anyone else, she had to take it. I was proud of her. It took a lot of courage to face everything head-on, and I knew it wasn't easy for her. We were finally starting to take control of the situation, and I hoped that it would be the beginning of the end of Brandon's influence on our lives. One afternoon, Megan had a meeting with Lisa and some of the other women who had been manipulated by Brandon. They were gathering statements to present to the licensing board, and Megan said she wanted to be a part of it. I stayed home, trying to keep myself distracted, but it was hard not to think about everything that was happening. I couldn't believe how far this had all spiraled out of control, and I just wanted it to be over. I was in the middle of making a sandwich when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Megan. Hey Dave, can you come pick me up? I don't think I can drive right now. I'll explain when you get here. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, my heart pounding as I drove to the address Megan had sent me. When I arrived, I saw her sitting on a bench outside, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. I parked the car and rushed over to her, my chest tightening with worry. Megan, what happened? I asked, sitting down beside her. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she wiped at her tears. It's worse than I thought, Dave, she whispered, her voice breaking. One of the women. She said that Brandon recorded their sessions. Not just the therapy sessions, but the other stuff. He recorded it all without their knowledge. I felt my stomach turn, my heart pounding in my chest. Are you saying he recorded you too? I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. She nodded, her tears spilling over, her face filled with a mixture of fear and anger. I don't know for sure, but if he recorded the others, then it's possible he recorded me too. I feel so violated, Dave. I don't know what to do. I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening into fists as I tried to keep my anger in check. We're going to the police, I said firmly. We're not letting him get away with this. Not after everything he's done. Megan looked at me, her eyes filled with fear. What if those videos are out there, Dave? What if people see them? I don't know if I can handle that. I took a deep breath, my heart aching as I pulled her into my arms. We'll figure it out, Meg, I whispered. We'll deal with whatever comes together, but we can't let him keep doing this to people. We have to fight back. She nodded against my chest, her tears soaking into my shirt. I know, she whispered. I'm so scared. I held her tightly, my heart pounding, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I didn't know what was going to happen next, didn't know if we were about to step into an even bigger nightmare, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't going to let Brandon control our lives anymore. We were going to fight back, and we were going to take our lives back. As we drove home, I could feel the tension in the air, the fear of what lay ahead. But I also knew that we weren't alone. Megan had Lisa, she had the other women, and most importantly, she had me. We were going to face this together, one step at a time. And as for Brandon, I hoped he was ready for what was coming his way, because we weren't backing down. After that day, Megan and I went to the police station together. It was a terrifying step, but it was one we knew we had to take. We explained everything, how Megan had been manipulated, how Dr. Brandon had crossed every ethical boundary imaginable, and how there was a possibility that he had recorded their sessions without her consent. The officers listened carefully, and they assured us that they would look into it. They said they would need to gather more evidence, speak to the other women, and see what they could find. It was a small relief, but it was a start. Over the next few days, we did our best to keep moving forward. Megan was in contact with Lisa and some of the other women who were also speaking to the police, and I tried my best to be there for her, even though every mention of Brandon made my blood boil. We were fighting back, and it felt good to be doing something, but it was also exhausting. The stress of the situation was taking its toll, and I could see it in Megan's eyes. How tired she looked, how much weight she was carrying. One evening, we decided to go out for dinner. Something to take our minds off everything, even if just for a little while. We went to our favorite Italian place, a small, cozy restaurant with dim lighting and checkered tablecloths. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were able to relax. We laughed over a bottle of wine, shared stories, and it almost felt like things were normal again. But, of course, nothing can stay peaceful for long. We were halfway through our meal when I noticed Megan's expression change. Her face went pale, her eyes widening in shock as she stared at something, or rather, someone behind me. My stomach dropped, and I turned around, my heart pounding. Standing at the entrance of the restaurant, looking just as smug and self-important as ever, was Dr. Brandon. He was scanning the room, and the moment his eyes landed on us, a smirk spread across his face. He waved like he was greeting old friends. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered under my breath, my fists clenching. Megan looked at me, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. "What is he doing here?" she whispered. I shook my head, my chest tightening. "I don't know, but we're not going anywhere. We have just as much right to be here as he does." Brandon made his way over to our table, his smile widening as he approached. Well, if it isn't my favorite couple," he said, his voice dripping with faux charm. "What a coincidence running into you here." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. "We're not interested in talking to you, Brandon," I said, my voice firm. "Why don't you just leave us alone?" He held up his hands, as if to show he meant no harm. "Whoa, no need to be hostile, Dave. I just wanted to say hello." Megan looked down, her hands trembling as she clenched her napkin. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You shouldn't even be practicing anymore." Brandon's smile faltered for a moment, but then he shrugged, his expression smug. "Well, until anything is proven, I'm still a free man. And as far as I know, this is a public place, and I'm allowed to eat wherever I want." I felt my blood pressure rising, the anger bubbling up inside me. I stood up, my hands clenched at my sides. "I'm warning you, Brandon. You need to leave." He looked at me, his smile fading, his eyes narrowing. "And if I don't? What are you going to do, Dave? You think you can scare me?" I took a step closer, my heart pounding, my chest tightening. "You've already done enough damage, Brandon. If you think we're going to let you keep hurting people, you're dead wrong." Brandon smirked, his eyes filled with contempt. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dave. You think you're going to come out on top, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." Before I could respond, Megan stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "You need to leave, Brandon," she said, her tears spilling over. "You've done enough." For a moment, I thought he was going to keep pushing, but then something in Megan's voice seemed to get through to him. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at both of us. "All right, I'll leave," he said finally, his voice dripping with annoyance. "But don't think this is over. You're going to regret crossing me." With that, he turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff, his face twisted with anger. I watched him go, my heart pounding, the tension still thick in the air. I turned back to Megan, my chest tightening when I saw the tears streaming down her face. "Come on," I said softly, my voice cracking. "Let's get out of here." We left the restaurant, the meal forgotten, and drove home in silence. The whole encounter had left both of us shaken, and I could see the fear in Megan's eyes, the fear that Brandon wasn't done with us, that he was still out there, still a threat. When we got home, Megan sank down onto the couch, her hands trembling as she wiped at her tears. "I'm so tired of this, Dave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so tired of being afraid. I just want this to be over." I knelt down in front of her, taking her hands in mine, my heart aching. "I know, Meg. I know it's hard. But we're going to get through this. We're not going to let him win. We're stronger than he is, and we're not alone in this." She nodded, her tears spilling over, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I don't understand why he's doing this. Why can't he just let us go?" I shook my head, my jaw clenched. "Because he's a coward, Meg. He's trying to intimidate us because he's scared. He knows we have the power to bring him down, and he's trying to keep control." The next day, Megan decided to contact the police again, letting them know about the encounter at the restaurant. They assured her that they were still investigating, and they said they would add the incident to their report. It was a small comfort, but it still felt like we were moving in the right direction, slowly but surely. One evening, while Megan was on the phone with Lisa, I decided to do a little digging of my own. I wanted to know more about Brandon, where he came from, what kind of life he lived. Maybe it was petty, but I wanted to understand the man who had caused us so much pain. I spent hours on the internet, searching for anything I could find. His professional profiles, his credentials, his social media, anything that might give me a glimpse into who he really was. And then, buried deep in a comment thread on a local news article, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a comment from a woman named Julia. She had posted it months ago, but it was clear she had once been a client of Brandon's. She wrote about how Brandon had manipulated her, how he had used his position to get close to her, and how, when she tried to break it off, he had threatened her. I clicked on her profile, my heart pounding. Her profile was private, but there was one post visible, a post about taking down Brandon, about fighting for justice. It was from the same time Megan had gone to the police, and it mentioned meeting other women who had been victims of his manipulation. Without thinking, I sent her a message. I introduced myself, explained that my wife was one of Brandon's former clients, and that we were trying to understand what we were up against. I didn't expect a response, but within minutes, my phone buzzed. Julia had replied. She wrote that she had been through the same thing, that Brandon had manipulated her, had used her vulnerability to get close to her, and that when she tried to end things, he had become aggressive. She said that she was willing to help in any way she could, and that she was in touch with some of the other women who were also fighting back. I felt a surge of hope as I read her message. We weren't alone. There were others who had been through the same thing, and they were willing to fight alongside us. I showed the message to Megan, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a spark of hope in her eyes. "We're going to get through this, Dave," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "We're going to fight back, and we're going to win." I nodded, my heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, we are," I said softly. "And Brandon, he's not going to know what hit him." The following week was a whirlwind of emotions and new developments. Megan and I were more determined than ever to see this through, to put an end to the nightmare that Dr. Brandon had caused. With Julia's help, we got in touch with some of the other women who had been manipulated by Brandon. It was heart-wrenching to hear their stories. Stories that were so similar to Megan's, filled with betrayal, manipulation, and fear. But it was also empowering. We weren't alone in this fight, and we were ready to take him down together. We decided to have a meeting with all of the women, along with Lisa and Julia. We gathered at Lisa's house, a safe place where everyone could feel comfortable sharing their stories and planning our next steps. When we all sat down in Lisa's living room, the atmosphere was a mix of tension, fear, and determination. I looked around at the group of women, each of them strong in their own right, each of them having faced Brandon's manipulation and come out the other side. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for Megan. She had been through so much, and yet she was here, ready to fight back. "Thank you all for coming," Lisa said, her voice filled with emotion. "I know this isn't easy, but we're in this together, and we're going to make sure Brandon can't hurt anyone else." Julia nodded, her face serious. "We've all been through the same thing. We trusted him, and he used that trust against us. But now it's time for us to take back control. One of the women, a quiet brunette named Sarah, spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. I never thought I'd have the courage to do this, but seeing all of you here, knowing I'm not alone, it makes me feel like maybe we can win this. Megan reached over, squeezing Sarah's hand. We can, she said softly, her eyes filled with determination. We're stronger than he thinks. We spent the rest of the afternoon sharing our stories, discussing the evidence we had, and planning our next steps. Julia had managed to find out more about Brandon's background, how he had moved from state to state, leaving a trail of manipulation and deceit behind him. He had never stayed in one place long enough for anyone to catch up with him, but this time he had underestimated the women he had targeted. With the help of Lisa, we compiled everything we had: text messages, emails, witness statements. We were going to present it all to the police and the licensing board, and we weren't going to stop until Brandon was held accountable. A few days later, Megan and I, along with Julia and a few of the other women, went to the police station to submit our evidence. The officers listened carefully as we presented everything, and I could see the look of disbelief on their faces as they realized the extent of Brandon's actions. They assured us that they would be taking this seriously, that they would be pursuing charges against him. It was a small victory, but it felt like a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. But we weren't done yet. We still needed to confront Brandon at the licensing board hearing. It was the final step in making sure he could never practice again, making sure he could never manipulate another vulnerable person. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I could tell that Megan was nervous. She had come so far, but the idea of facing Brandon in a formal setting was terrifying. The day of the hearing finally arrived. Megan, Julia, and I arrived at the building, our hearts pounding as we made our way inside. The room was small and formal, with a long table where the board members sat. Brandon was already there, sitting at the other end of the room, his face blank as he watched us walk in. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything that had led us to this point. The board members called the hearing to order, and each of us took turns presenting our statements, sharing our stories of how Brandon had manipulated us, how he had used his position to take advantage of his clients. As I listened to Megan speak, my heart swelled with pride. She spoke with a quiet strength, her voice steady as she recounted everything that had happened, how she had trusted Brandon, how he had betrayed that trust, and how she had found the courage to fight back. Brandon sat there, his expression impassive, as each of the women spoke. He didn't say a word, didn't try to defend himself. He knew he was cornered, and there was nothing he could say to justify what he had done. When the hearing ended, the board members took a brief recess to discuss their decision. The room was silent, the tension almost unbearable. Megan reached over, taking my hand in hers, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. After what felt like an eternity, the board members returned. The chairperson, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, cleared her throat, her eyes scanning the room. After reviewing the evidence presented here today, it is the decision of this board that Dr. Brandon's license be revoked, effective immediately. Furthermore, this matter will be referred to the appropriate authorities for further investigation. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, and I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. We had done it. We had taken him down. Brandon's face twisted in anger, his eyes narrowing as he looked at us. But he didn't say a word. He stood up and walked out of the room, his shoulders stiff, his face pale. He was finished. As we left the building, Megan turned to me, her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief. "It's over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We did it." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly, my heart swelling with emotion. "We did," I said softly. "You were so brave, Meg. I'm so proud of you." She looked up at me, her tears spilling over, her smile widening. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dave. You stood by me through everything, even when I didn't deserve it. I love you." I smiled, my heart aching with love for her. "I love you too, Meg, and I'm so glad we made it through this together." As we walked out of the building, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. We had faced our worst fears, confronted the man who had tried to tear us apart, and we had won. It wasn't going to be easy to move forward. There were still wounds that needed to heal, still trust that needed to be rebuilt. But I knew that we were on the right path. We were stronger than we had ever been, and we were ready to take on whatever came next. That evening, we celebrated with Lisa, Julia, and the rest of the group. It was a small gathering at our house, filled with laughter, food, and the overwhelming sense of victory. Megan and I stood in the kitchen, watching as everyone talked and laughed, and I realized just how far we had come. We had faced betrayal, fear, and manipulation, but we had come out the other side stronger, together. Julia raised her glass, her eyes shining with emotion. To Megan, and to all of us, she said, her voice filled with pride. We fought back and we won. Here's to taking our lives back. We all raised our glasses, a sense of triumph washing over us. Megan looked at me, her eyes filled with love, and I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we were ready to face them. Together, one day at a time. Bye-bye.